I do consider the United States and Iran to have been in a state of war, I guess you could call it, roughly since the revolution. It's had, hotter moments and colder war type moments, quieter and louder. But yeah, it's basically been a state of hostilities between the two countries since then.
Welcome to another episode of Global Power Shifts. Today we're being joined by Jon Finer. He's the co-host of the Long Game podcast from Vox Media. He's also former Deputy National Security Advisor under President Biden, and he was closely involved with U.S.-Iran policy at the very highest level. He helped to negotiate the JCPOA. Some people, of course, will know that as the Iran deal during the Obama years, and he has argued that withdrawing from the Iran deal and pursuing maximum pressure has actually worsened Iran's regional behavior and pushed its nuclear program closer to the danger zone. He's recently been warning about open-ended escalation, unclear endgames, and the fantasy of clean regime change by force. So great to have you with us. Obviously, you spent years negotiating the Iran deal, which Trump ultimately killed, I guess, in 2017. Given all the work that you put into this, all the work and effort to avoid the kind of scenario that we're seeing today, how does it feel on a personal level?
Yeah, so I have two, first of all, thanks for having me on. Good to be with you guys. I have two sort of personal touchstones when it comes to this issue. The first is I actually started my career in the same line of work you all are in or were in, which is journalism, covering the U.S. invasion of Iraq. It was my first real job, first real assignment. And it's what got me interested in policy because I started to ask myself, like, how did we end up in a situation like this? Who makes these decisions and why? And I remember leaving Iraq after spending a few years covering that war thinking, well, not a lot of good can come out of something this terrible and tragic, but maybe one good thing is that we will not make this sort of mistake again. Fast forward, to my time in government, a big part of my motivation, I think President Obama's motivation in doing the Iran nuclear deal was exactly that lesson of the Iraq war. Better to avoid a war that can be so costly, so damaging to our own country, to people on the other end of U.S. policy, if you can do a diplomatic deal that accomplishes your interests and your objectives, which I believe that deal did. So President Trump has now both undone that deal and violated what I think was the cardinal lesson of Iraq, which is no unnecessary wars, especially in the Middle East, without clear objectives and with a low likelihood of success. And that's unfortunately where we are.
Jon, for those of the members of our audience who might not be familiar with what a diplomatic breakthrough the Iran nuclear deal was, can you tell us what it actually achieved, but also what you didn't manage to achieve?
Yeah. So, I think it's important to be candid about both. So I'm glad you asked. The main achievements of the Iran nuclear deal was that it took the amount of time that it would take Iran to actually get a nuclear weapon, if it decided to do that, from somewhere on the order of a few weeks to a few months when we started negotiating, to well more than a year when the deal was in place. And it would have been well more than a year for somewhere on the order of 10 to 15 years, the sort of full duration of the diplomatic deal if we hadn't withdrawn. The reason that's important is not because we necessarily trust the Iranians to comply with the deal in full, although the other very important part of this agreement was that we had international monitors all over Iran's nuclear sites to verify their compliance. And when the United States pulled out of the deal, all of those monitors and American intelligence said that Iran actually was complying in full. But the reason that 1 year was so important was that if we found out that Iran was cheating, was moving secretly, covertly towards a nuclear weapon, we had enough time to put in place a plan to address that, militarily if necessary. And President Obama was very clear, as was President Biden, that if Iran ever moved in the direction of a nuclear weapon, which it has not done, by the way, has not had a nuclear weapons program since 2002 or 2003. But if it ever did that, we would take military action to stop it. And a year would give us enough time to put in place a plan to do that effectively. Those were the accomplishments of the deal. And it had lots of technical details about how many centrifuges Iran could have, how much uranium it could stockpile, at what level. But the upshot was it gave them a year to get a nuclear weapon if they would try, and us enough time to stop it. What the deal didn't accomplish, and I think this was a decision that was made by our administration, was it did not focus on other damaging, disturbing things that Iran does in the region. It did not focus on Iran's missile program. It did not focus on Iran's sponsorship of terrorist organizations in the region. By the way, U.S. sanctions and U.S. efforts to stop those things also did not come off during the deal. Only the nuclear sanctions came off. So basically, we made an agreement on the nuclear issue. We agreed to keep fighting it out with Iran on these other issues. And the reason we did that was, one, the nuclear program was the most important thing to U.S. interests, the biggest threat, the biggest area of concern. So we prioritized, almost in an America First style, the thing that mattered to us most. And second, we did not believe that there was a deal that was gettable if we brought those other issues into the conversation. And I think there's good evidence of that now, because President Trump also tried to get those other issues into his negotiations with the Iranians. They said no, and now we're at war.
And so you mentioned you didn't think that you would be able to trust Iranians, the Iranian regime officials that you were negotiating with. Can you
And I'd
kind
say
of
that was
take us?
probably mutual. I would imagine they felt the same way. But yeah, sorry, go ahead.
And the thing is, we're saying, oh, we're now at war with Iran, but the U.S. and the Islamic Republic of Iran has been at war with the United States for 47 years, since 1979, since its birth, and part of its entire identity is being at war for the U.S. So, with the U.S. rather, can you take us inside the negotiating room? I mean, how were you able to kind of sift through this blanket of distrust between the two?
Yeah, so you're right, by the way. I do consider the United States and Iran to have been in a state of war, I guess you could call it, roughly since the revolution. It's had, hotter moments and colder war type moments, quieter and louder. But yeah, it's basically been a state of hostilities between the two countries since then. I think what mattered most in terms of getting a deal was that you had actually two governments that decided that it was preferable to make compromises, because negotiations require compromise, that were maybe imperfect, that required each country to give up some areas of its kind of interests in order to avoid the tragic outcome of another war. We were actually often criticized during the course of the negotiations and afterwards for saying the alternative to this deal is very likely that the two countries will go to war. People said that was fear-mongering. You're just trying to scare people. Actually, maybe the alternative is more pressure and the regime will collapse and democracy will flourish. I think that view, that a war was the most likely alternative, was validated and vindicated by where we are now. But what happened in the negotiations was you had a government of Iran, a new government of Iran at that time, led by President Hassan Rouhani, who, people sometimes mistakenly refer to him as a moderate or a reformer. I mean, he came out of the same, Suzanne, as you well know, revolutionary tradition as other Iranian leaders, but he did prioritize trying to get Iran economic benefits, reopening Iran to the West. And he knew that in order to do that, he had to deal with this issue of the nuclear program, which had led to all of these sanctions that were crushing Iran's economy. You had an American president, Barack Obama, who did not have a ton of experience in foreign policy, but was the one candidate in the 2008 election who made the centerpiece of his approach that he had been opposed to the Iraq War and that he would be open to talking to American adversaries diplomatically. By the way, President Trump says this too, that it's better to talk to our adversaries than to fight them, or at least he used to. So those two leaders, I think, set a tone that made a negotiation possible that might not have been possible previously, and might not have been possible had either of those leaders been different on each side.
Hmm. What was the calculus by the administration that you served in terms of the kind of reforms that might have been made possible within Iran beyond just the economy, had the nuclear deal stayed intact?
So my own view is that the deal should be judged on its own merits. What did we get? What did we give up? Not at all based on what might have happened in Iran over time as it opened economically to the West and had more access to business people and would Iran have evolved positively? I think there were people who believed or hoped that that might be the case. That was really not ever a part of our calculus in doing the deal. We wanted to solve one particular problem, the nuclear issue. And we knew we would have to come back at these other problems, sponsorship of terrorism, the missile program, that these were not going away, that we'd have to be relentless in our sanctions pressure and our other pressure. But this deal was about one thing. And we never believed, at least I'll speak for myself, I never believed that because Iran did this deal, it meant that Iran was going to become a kind of Jeffersonian democracy in the years ahead, or that the U.S. would ever actually have more normal relations with Iran in the near term. Some people might have hoped that. That was not, I think, the core of the argument for us.
But there was an accidental achievement in that, like you said, so you weren't able to deal with the extracurricular activities of the Iranian regime and stop their funding of terror proxies. But there was a ton of money that was released as part of the nuclear deal. And yet we saw that none of that money went to the people. And that was kind of a turning point, I believe, from what I've seen and from speaking to sources inside the country, where they realize, okay, this deal has happened, but our economic situation hasn't improved. We're still isolated. Things haven't really changed for us, but things have gotten better for Hezbollah, for example. And so, I mean, was that ever something that was part of your calculus?
So I think you're right that Iran has made a series of terrible decisions when it comes to governance, when it comes to how it treats its own population. I mean, this is one of the most brutally repressive regimes anywhere on Earth. And I think part of the theory of doing the deal was that when Iran was under sanctions, heavily maximum pressure type sanctions before the deal, and then obviously went back to that after Trump pulled out of the deal, the main beneficiaries of that system were the Revolutionary Guard, the IRGC, the sort of military cadre that protects the government and the revolution, because they played an enormous role in Iran's economy, essentially gobbling up what scarce resources existed in that country for themselves, for their friends, for their allies. I think the hope among ordinary Iranians was that as the country opened, when the deal was in place, and as more Western businesses and other international businesses started to operate, commercial activity inside Iran, that the economic benefits would flow more broadly. But you had a government there that, that was not a priority, let's just say. I think for people like Hassan Rouhani, actually, his whole political success depended on being able to show the Iranian people some benefits from the deal. But he struggled to do that. And I think in large part, he struggled to do that because the IRGC continued to fight for what it believed was its share of the economic benefit of this deal. And to be honest, a lot of companies looked at what happened. And by the way, in retrospect, they weren't wrong, and thought, I'm going to give this a few years and see if this deal really sticks and really takes hold. And lo and behold, we have an election in the United States. We elect a president who said this was the stupidest deal, the dumbest deal of all time, and then pulled out of it. So companies were not unwise to be a bit cautious and a bit hesitant because ultimately the deal did not end up staying, not because of Iran, but because of us.
What are your thoughts on how the Trump administration weaponized the return of the money? I mean, that must have been a given that was going to happen.
Sorry, can you explain what you mean by weaponize the return of the money?
Yeah, so the money that was in the United States that was returned to Iran, I feel like that's something that the Trump administration and the Republicans have
you mean
weaponized.
the attacks on
of cash.
Yeah, it's interesting.
The cash.
So a few things on this. One is, like, this was a negotiation, right? And I think people outside of the negotiation always want to say things like, well, why didn't you get this? And why didn't you get that? And why did you give them anything? This is a terrible regime. Why would you give them any benefit? Well, I mean, the answer to that is because we are asking for significant things from Iran, and countries are not generally in the business, even when they're under serious pressure, of just giving away concessions when they don't get anything in return. That is what a negotiation is at the end of the day. And the main thing that Iran was seeking in this negotiation was some sort of economic benefit. Again, because President Rouhani had this theory that he had run for president on, that, he wanted to broadly benefit Iran's economy by opening it up a bit. So, and so that's why they got an economic benefit out of the deal. That was what they were negotiating for. And we believe that economic benefit was quite modest. And I think if you look at what happened in Iran's economy during the course of the time the deal was in place, it was not some massive windfall for Iran, which we had said all along. The pallets of cash argument drives me a bit crazy, I will say, in part because the reason that some of this money had to go to Iran in cash is exactly because our sanctions regime was so severe and remained so severe, even under the deal, that our banking system could not intersect with Iran's banking system. You couldn't do a Zelle payment, to Iran, or whatever the equivalent of that was at the time. You couldn't do a bank wire transfer. So the only way they could get this money was the old-fashioned way. And I'm sure that was not their preference, actually. I'm sure they would have loved our banking systems to be integrated and connected, but we didn't give them that benefit. So this was actually reflective of the severity of the sanctions, not the opposite. But, arguments are what they are.
Mm. I've been based in the Gulf for the past 10 years. I'm curious, what are your reactions in terms of the fallout on, Gulf allies? Was that always a given that should anything happen in Iran, that they would lash out and attack places like Dubai, Riyadh, and so on? And how concerned are people like you in the foreign policy space that that's going to jeopardize the U.S.'s relationship with the Gulf?
So when we used to war game what a conflict with Iran might look like, there were two assumptions that were sort of baked in, maybe more than two, but two big ones that were baked into the consequences for us if we went down this path. One was that the Strait of Hormuz would be closed. So the idea that nobody ever warned about, the idea that the strait would be closed is preposterous. It was a kind of a core assumption of all of this. And the other was that Iran would lash out broadly at American bases in the region, at American allies in the region, certainly at Israel and the United States to the extent it could reach us, but at other targets too. So none of this should have been a surprise to anybody. But I do think the 12-day war last summer gave the United States and probably some of the Gulf countries a bit of a false sense of security. Because in that conflict, Israel and then the United States did attack Iran. Iran retaliated against Israel in a significant way. It retaliated only in the briefest way and sort of telegraphed its response against the Gulf. It shot some missiles at a U.S. base in Qatar, and then the conflict ended. So the United States paid very little price for that war. Israel paid a modest price, but not nearly as much, I think, as they expected to pay. And the Gulf paid almost no price for that conflict. So you fast forward to the most recent war. The Gulf countries, I think, were against this. There have been some reporting to the contrary, but I think generally speaking, the Gulf countries were not supportive of the United States going to war in Iran. But I do not think they believe they were going to be attacked in the way that they have been. 80% is my understanding plus of the munitions that have been fired out of Iran have been fired at the UAE, just one of the Gulf countries. Saudi has absorbed a lesser number, but still significant. Qatar as well. Oman has been hit. Kuwait has been hit. They've fired as far away as Turkey and Azerbaijan. I think some of those were, maybe examples of bad decision making or bad command and control. But Iran has lashed out everywhere. I think this should have been expected because, unlike the last war, Iran saw this as a war for its very existence, a war to preserve its governance, its regime. And so it was going to go as far as it possibly could to try to show that there was a cost for that.
If Trump, against all odds, I mean, if he manages to walk away from this and have not the regime still in place, but a similar regime, maybe the military in Iran, and there's no proper kind of regime change, the system stays intact, how dangerous does that become for the long-term security of the Gulf? And do you have any thoughts on how that might impact investment as well? Because if there are question marks around security, especially long-term question marks for 5, 7, 10 years, that's not going to be a good thing for a part of the world that's now incredibly integrated into the
Yeah.
world economy.
Yeah. So you're in the Gulf. I think the number one concern that Gulf friends who I talk to have is that Iran will be left intact, more or less. Maybe its capabilities reduced, but still intact. Angrier than it was before the conflict, harder lined than it was before the conflict. And the United States will move on. We're pretty far away from Iran. They do not have missile capability to reach us. We're already talking about other countries that we're interested in toppling. The president muses about Cuba from time to time, but his attention span is relatively short. He will eventually move on, and the countries in the region where you're living are going to have to remain in close proximity to a very angry, aggrieved country that has high capability to do them harm. I think that is what they're most worried about. You're seeing, in particular, Emirati leaders, Anwar Gargash from the foreign ministry, Yusuf Al-Otaiba, the ambassador in Washington, wrote an op-ed about this that basically says whether or not we were for this at the beginning, now the most dangerous thing to do would be to leave this kind of wounded tiger in place and intact. And I think, unfortunately, that is probably the trajectory that this is on. Your question about investment is one I've thought a lot about because I think it cuts a number of ways. There are going to be big investment opportunities in the Gulf itself to rebuild some of the infrastructure that has been badly damaged. That may be an opportunity for some. But I think the risk is the Gulf is not just a destination for investment. Actually, most often it is a source of investment capital for the rest of the world, and particular, the technology build out that's happening in the United States, the AI race, data centers, much of this is being fueled and funded by Gulf capital. And that money, I think, is going to have to be reallocated towards their own societies for a time being. So the impact of this is going to extend far beyond the Gulf, but to the industries in America and elsewhere that have been big beneficiaries of this partnership for some time.
Jon, I want to switch over to the human level, the human side of the story, particularly the people inside Iran who I have kept in touch with. And in fact, one of my contacts on the ground just managed to escape, and we'll have him on soon. But what was really interesting speaking to him was that there seems to be no command and control within the IRGC to the point where this kind of person should not have been left out of the country, and he was. And so my question is, if this is a way of indicating that perhaps there is a path to regime collapse, one, do you think that would be a good thing? And two, what role and how should the US operate in supporting the people? Because at the end of the day, it is going to have to be the people who rise up and take them down and take over. In fact, I mean, I keep saying that this regime didn't come into place on its own. It came in with a revolution in 1979. The people overthrew the Shah, but there were Western countries that helped the Ayatollah return.
So first of all, I'm very glad you asked about the people. Too often these policy conversations get bound up in kind of high politics and other things. And as I said, I mean, my first frame of reference on war was seeing the implications of war for people thousands of miles away from where the decisions are made and what they have to go through. And I've tried during the course of my career to never lose track of that, lose sight of that, because it should matter just as much as any of the other objectives that we have in these conflicts. In this one, I worry, and I hate to not be at all reassuring that Iran is about to go through, I think, a very difficult period, even more difficult in some ways than the 40 or 50 years that have preceded it. Because, I think right now we have maybe a version of the regime that was in place before that is still in power. But I don't think the next phase of this, if it continues, is going to be the democratic uprising that maybe was, being discussed in January, and then it was crushed as brutally as it was soon after that. I think it's more likely a military takeover of the current government, where you get the IRGC basically saying, all right, we're in a crisis. Enough of these clerics telling us what to do. We've played a pretty significant role in governance up till now, and now we are formally in charge. So you shift from clerical rule to military rule. But even if that eventually collapses, in my view, the next phase, again, still is not yet democratic. It is something more like a failed state. where different factions are in charge in different parts of the country, maybe even a version of the sort of factional civil war that we saw in Syria, where the government hangs on to a piece and opposition groups are in charge elsewhere. That is a pretty ugly, pretty messy scenario. And don't forget, in Syria, while yes, Assad ultimately fell, it took, 11, 12, 13 years for that to play out. It was not immediate. And there you had an armed opposition, whereas largely the opposition in Iran is unarmed. So while I want nothing more than the collapse of the regime, the organic collapse of the regime, by the way, not under military force, at the hands of an uprising by the Iranian people, I think that would be good for first and foremost Iran, but for the rest of the world, good for the United States, good for everybody. I think we have some serious hurdles to go through before we get to that point.
So there obviously is no real organized opposition inside Iran. Part of the reason for that is because every time there is an attempt at organization, people get thrown in Evin prison. I'm the executive producer of a documentary about one of these women who organized during Women Life Freedom, and she was thrown in prison like many others. And so the only real opposition figure that exists whose name was chanted in the streets during the January uprisings before it was brutally cracked down on is the Crown Prince Reza Pahlavi. And I'm curious if you've ever had any dealings with him, and also in general, your thoughts on whether that's even possible, how it would be possible, what role the US would have to play in essentially facilitating his return the way the his return was facilitated.
So I've not met him personally, so I don't have sort of personal reflections or views in that way, like some of the other figures in this drama. But I was struck by what you just noted, which was unlike, I think, in previous moments of sort of popular uprising in Iran, he was sort of more central on the minds from the mouths of the demonstrators, which surprised me a bit because as you know, generally in these circumstances, the people who are outside of the country, the diaspora, as supportive as they are and can be, do not tend to be the people who are being championed and celebrated by the people who are suffering inside. And I think that's a natural inclination. If you are the ones kind of going through it inside Iran, you want somebody who's gone through it with you to rise up and lead the country. I think that tends to be how it goes in most countries. In this case, it has been at least much more mixed and muddled. He was talked about quite a lot. He put out a lot of messaging that I thought, some of which at least I thought was helpful, that he would be a transitional figure of some kind, not some kind of returning king. But it does feel like this is a moment that is more past than current right now. President Trump has been a bit dismissive, frankly, of Reza Pahlavi. I don't know exactly why that is. I don't know if Trump has any relationship with him at all, but basically seemed to kind of talk down the prospects. And at this point, even though the idea of U.S. intervening in Iran began because President Trump said he wanted to help or support the protesters, he said, help is on the way. Seize the institutions of your government. He basically directly told them he was going to intervene militarily to help them. So much time went by after that. And so many people were killed, maybe more than 30,000, maybe more than that, for all we know. I don't think we have a good count. That, the democratic moment may have to come at a later stage. And, I don't see any real prospect of somebody from outside of Iran, whoever it is, returning in the near term to lead.
So Trump keeps talking about sort of leaders inside who he's identified, and he's keeping them alive. And we're all kind of reading the tea leaves of who is this supposed to be. He obviously thinks that Venezuela was a success, and so he's been wanting to pull a Venezuela, although Venezuela and Islamic Republic of Iran are two very different places. And so let's just say he tries to pull a Venezuela, and like maybe some level, maybe it works. Who could be a Delcy? And I asked this question because in end of December, when the protests really started, it kind of took a while for the Western media to pick up on them because it was during the holidays. And these protests actually started on smaller cities in various parts of Iran, cities, honestly, people in Tehran hadn't even heard of. And so it was really an indication of like, this is truly an economic moment where people have just had it and they are so done with the regime. And it is political in the sense that it's political because it was economic. Now, that being said, Pezeshkian, the current president, came out early sort of speaking in support of the protesters, as in understanding where they were coming from. And I kind of thought, is this a Gorbachev moment? Follow the Soviet Union and whatnot. But we've already seen that the IRGC has exercised its power and recognized that, we don't take you seriously, in that Pezeshkian said, we shouldn't have hit our neighbors. And then next thing you know, the IRGC hits Dubai again and said, no, Ms. Pezeshkian's the one who made the mistake. Now, my question is, you've dealt with people like Javad Zarif, and there had been rumors for some time that he had presidential ambitions. Is he a dark horse?
Well, and his deputy at the time of the JCPOA was Abbas Araghchi, who's now the current Iranian foreign minister, and for all we know, maybe somebody who's indirectly or directly in touch with the U.S. They say they're talking to some Iranians. That would be a natural point of contact for them, although I don't know one way or the other whether they are talking to him. Look, I guess what I think is anybody whose name is associated with the JCPOA outreach engagement with the West has, unfortunately, and I think this is a bad thing, been discredited precisely because the United States pulled out of that deal and then attacked Iran multiple times. The argument that people like Javad Zarif were making was, okay, you can't trust the Americans. I don't like the Americans, but we are better off doing a diplomatic deal with the Americans. And if we do a deal, it will benefit Iran than we are continuing to fight them for 30 or 40 more years. And the reality is, if you're the hardliners who are arguing against that, you say to Zarif now, I'm sorry, the U.S. then violated the deal that you made and has now gone to war with us. So why do you have any credibility left to tell us how Iran should handle its affairs? So I think somebody like that is probably a very unlikely kind of next leader. He doesn't have a formal role, as I understand it, in the government anymore. But Abbas, who is his deputy, who is a formidable diplomat, capable person, close ties to the security establishment, I don't think is a future leader of Iran, but probably somebody who is going to be involved in trying to resolve this whenever it does get resolved. His messaging, by the way, it's worth reading his Twitter feed at some point. It's been quite interesting, to me at least. It is very much aimed at like an American domestic political audience. He talks about inflation in the United States. He talks about gas prices. He's clearly trying to benefit from his knowledge of our society, of us, to point out the flaws in the theory of the war and how it's going to harm Americans. I don't think he's a very credible messenger on this, maybe not a very compelling one, but it's interesting that he's even trying from his position to sort of influence the discourse here.
So as somebody who was a journalist and also shaped policy, I'm really glad you brought this up, because from my perspective, having, been on the receiving end of their public diplomacy and charm offensive of trying to use the benefits of democracy like freedom of the press to their advantage, which is something that they deny their own people, they have been so successful at kind of working the Western press that exactly Araghchi is on Western media all the time when the rest of the country doesn't have access to the internet and doesn't know what's happening. They don't know what's happening. They don't have access to media. And so like this person who just got out of Iran was telling me, there's this sense that Western media almost wants Trump to lose this war. And so I think my question to you is, I mean, the information war is just as important as the actual kinetic aspects of the war. From a U.S. perspective, what would you be doing if you were in the Situation Room right now?
So I think everybody is playing in this information space, some more effectively than others. I think the messaging you've been seeing out of the Gulf recently, that the war can't stop until Iran's capabilities have been further degraded, is intended to message to an American audience, to the president, to the American people about how important this is. That's a novel aspect. We talked about Iran's messaging. I think the Trump administration has both been effective in one way and very ineffective in another in its information warfare. Where it's been effective is in talking down U.S. markets. It's remarkable, by the way. We have seen significant commodity price increases, particularly oil and gas in the United States and elsewhere, but not as much as you would expect, just given the severe supply disruption that's taken place. After Russia invaded Ukraine, oil spiked to more than $120 a barrel, and not a single physical barrel of oil ever came off the market in the aftermath of that conflict. So there was no change in supply. The price spiked just on kind of vibes and speculation about where all this could go. Now we have a situation in which massive amounts of energy supply have come off the market, both oil and gas. And we have not seen a return to those those Russia-Ukraine levels of energy prices, which makes no sense other than you have a president going out regularly and telling the markets this is almost over. He said very complete at one point, a few more days at one point. This is now weeks ago. Every time we come out and say, oh, we're about to negotiate with Iran and Pakistan or whatever, the talks are going very well. To me, this is all aimed at managing market reaction to keep the pressure off of the United States to end the war. And, I don't understand markets, I guess, because for reasons that are inexplicable to me, it is working to a large extent. Where their messaging has been actually, I think, quite dismal is on what we were actually trying to do in this war. It's different every day. It's different sometimes multiple times within the same day. It's different sometimes multiple times within the same day by the same person. And so when people cannot understand what we're trying to accomplish, I think they will have a very hard time, maybe even a harder time selling this as a success or explaining why all of a sudden it's going to come to an end when it does finally come to an end, because nobody really seems to know what this is about, including the people making the decision to wage it.
I think it would probably be fair to say that Netanyahu has been a master at exploiting events to his own benefit. It's been quite the turnaround for him since October 7th, especially in terms of the support that he has in Israel. And I also believe that regime change in Iran has always been seen as sort of a holy grail for him personally. To what extent do you think that he's influencing and perhaps even manipulating the Trump administration with this conflict in Iran? Because it feels like it might be serving Israel's interests more than the interests of the United States at the moment.
So there's no doubt that Netanyahu wanted this conflict, advocated for this conflict as he did for the 12-day war. I mean, and the reason I know that is, one, because it's obvious he says it as much, but two, because he's been advocating for this sort of thing for decades. He advocated that the Obama administration take military action against Iran. He advocated that the Biden administration take military action against Iran. I'm quite confident he made the same arguments during the first Trump administration too. So he's not the variable. He's been consistent in making this approach. And while, I do believe that he was an important factor in persuading President Trump to take this action, if you're the United States, if you're a superpower, it is preposterous to me to outsource your decision-making or to blame for your decision-making anybody else. President Trump could do whatever President Trump wanted to do. He has tons of credibility in Israel. And if he told Prime Minister Netanyahu, no, this is not in our interest, we're not going to do this, and by the way, neither should you, he not only could have weathered that, it would have made no difference politically to President Trump in the United States, in Israel, or anywhere else. So, this is on us. We decided to do this, the current administration, and I do not believe in passing the buck or the blame on anybody else. They should be blamed for what they're doing. Our decision, stops with us.
So in 2009, let's just go back a little bit. In 2009, there was the Green Revolution, an uprising in Iran, and President Obama later admitted that he wished he'd done something. What should he have done and could he have done at the time that would have, I think, maybe changed the course of history?
So I think there are a few things. I don't think, by the way, President Obama was saying I should have gone to war to help that uprising, and I don't believe that President Obama should have done that. But what I do believe is, first, he should have spoken out much more forcefully and much sooner on the side of the demonstrators, to leave kind of ambiguity or uncertainty about kind of whose side you're on when you're a figure of such kind of, at that time, real moral authority and standing like Barack Obama was, I think was a mistake, and kind of left a big tool in our toolbox on the sideline instead of deploying it on behalf of the demonstrators. Second, and this is something we actually did do in the Biden administration, and that I think the Trump administration did in the most recent uprisings, is one of the things that becomes very difficult in these moments is because the Iranian regime has control over the internet, can kind of block people from being able to communicate with each other. It becomes very hard to organize and coordinate these demonstrations. And what we tried to facilitate was providing technology to the demonstrators that allowed them to communicate securely so they could continue to organize and continue to kind of sustain the revolution. I think that would have been a good thing to look at doing. And then third is, we've got sanctions in place on Iran now that are kind of massive and across the whole society. We had fewer in place in 2009, and most of them at that point were directed at people involved in the nuclear program or entities, people involved in terrorism or entities, maybe people involved in the missile program. But what we should have done, I think, is singled out people who were involved in repression of their own people, of the Iranian people, shamed their names publicly and sanctioned them too. Now, you add all this stuff up. Would it have made a difference? Would it have led to the Green Revolution toppling the regime? I'm certainly not making that argument. But in terms of what would have been the right thing for the United States to do, I think all of those would have been the right things to do.
Was the desire for a nuclear deal part of the calculation for not doing anything in 2009?
I think it was part of it, but I also think, from having been around during those conversations, that there were people inside the government, experts, genuine experts on Iran inside the U.S. government, saying the risk here is that the more you associate yourself with the demonstrators, the more the demonstrators become discredited as kind of puppets of the United States, which is a very frequent accusation leveled at them by the Iranian regime. I think the problem with that argument is that the Iranian regime is going to make it anyway. They're going to say this whether we help or not. So if they're going to say this either way, better that we help than that we don't. But I think that was the other argument that people were making at the time.
Jon, a little bit of a pivot. One of the regions we're watching quite closely here on the podcast is the Horn of Africa and the Red Sea. I'm actually half Ethiopian, half Swedish myself. And we spoke to the former presidential advisor on foreign affairs to the president of Somaliland. He's now the first ambassador to Israel. Huge move back in December, I think, late December, when Israel decided to recognize Somaliland. Obviously, there's been a lot of talk about the U.S. following suit eventually. Senator Ted Cruz is one of the people in D.C. that's pushing for this. Do you see an opening for that to actually happen? And can you talk about how that might change things in a big way when it comes to the Horn of Africa specifically?
Yeah. So, there is, it's a complicated question for a number of reasons. The main one being that generally the practice of the United States government is not to recognize kind of fragments of states absent a lot more history, a lot more justification, a lot more autonomy and self-rule. It's a pretty unusual move, what's happening in Somaliland. The Emirates has obviously played a role in sustaining that. Israel took a major step. Israel is sort of seeking around the world diplomatic recognition of normalization for its country. So there's a mutual benefit there to the recognition of Somaliland. As you said, they've sent an ambassador. I do not see how it's in the United States' interest to go down this path. I think more state fragmentation in that part of the world, is a recipe potentially for more conflict. And I don't, in looking at this, see a ton of diplomatic benefit or other benefit for the United States in doing this. Doesn't mean they won't. Though, this administration works in mysterious ways. But for Israel, they now have access to a country that is strategically located, proximate to some of their adversaries. They get diplomatic recognition out of this. Another country on the list of Abraham Accords kind of plus. But for the United States, which has resisted for a very long time, for example, recognizing Palestine as a state, to go and recognize Somaliland would feel a bit hard to explain.
I think we could go on forever, but we should probably start wrapping up. So your podcast is called The Long Game, and our podcast is called Global Power Shifts. What? Global
You guys
power
might have
shifts?
a catchier name.
Well, it's like shortened to GPS, right? So there's all kinds
There you
of
go. Good.
puns going on around here. I guess, in the long run, what kind of chess moves are going to happen, do you think, off the back of this conflict? And what kind of power shifts do you think we'll be seeing? I think, there's this sense that war is the gut reaction to solving problems, which is a very masculine response to things. And I obviously think about this as the person who started Women Building Peace. And I think I'd go back to when I was in Iran in 2005. I'll never forget this moment. Ahmadinejad has just been elected, and because he wore a suit, people thought that he would be different and that evolution was coming. And Tehran's traffic is really bad, and we were stuck in traffic. And this man next to us started chatting with my uncle, who was very proud of his American niece visiting. And long story short, he turned to me and in Farsi said, "Please go back and tell George Bush that he liberated Karbala and to please come and liberate us." So he meant the Iraq invasion. And just to go back to how we began this program, which was the invasion of Iraq and how that inspired your career to pivot from journalism to policy, which obviously Iraq had huge global ramifications. Are we in another Iraq moment?
So I think it depends to some extent on how long this goes and to some extent on how it ends. But, in assessing who ultimately gets the better of this conflict and kind of what the ramifications are, to me, the most important question is about deterrence. In some ways, I think Iran believed that it had lost its deterrent against the West. As a result, to some extent, of losing its proxy Hamas, its proxy Hezbollah, its ally Bashar al-Assad, and then having suffered during the 12-day war a pretty bad beating at the hands of mostly Israel and the United States, losing a lot of its nuclear program in the process and some of its missile capability without imposing any meaningful cost on its adversaries in the process. I think for Iran, that felt like an untenable, unsustainable situation. So when this war came, it, I think, has had one strategic objective that it is trying to achieve, and I think having some success, which is to make this so costly for the world, for the United States, that no American president can contemplate doing this kind of thing again anytime soon. If Iran succeeds at that, then I think it will have the upper hand because it will have reestablished the deterrent of being able to take down a big part of the global economy if you come at us. That will be Iran's sort of strategic victory that it will try to acclaim. The United States and Israel also have a version of this, which is, they will want to be able to argue that their deterrent is that we can take out all of Iran's leadership, reduce its military capabilities to rubble if Iran does things that are unacceptable to us, like pursuing a nuclear weapons program, like menacing its neighbors. The problem is, for all the destruction of Iran's capabilities that has taken place during the course of this conflict, it is still right now able to fight and fight to the extent that the Strait of Hormuz is maybe not closed, but is essentially an Iranian toll road that you can gain access to if you are in good favor and you are barred from using if you're their enemy. And if the war ends with that still the case, or even with that still as a possibility, I think it's going to be very hard to argue with the fact that Iran has gotten the better of this. So we'll see how it all plays out.
Jon Finer, former U.S. Deputy National Security Advisor and now co-host of The Long Game podcast by Vox Media. Follow him on YouTube and where you get your podcasts, and also follow us, Global Power Shifts, on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Instagram, everywhere. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks
Thank you,
again,
Jon.
guys. It was good to be with you.